Finally, a few words about the Federal Reserve and banks. The reason I do this is that a number of you have asked me, both people viewing from the outside and those of you that come here, to talk about the Federal Reserve. And part of me wants to do it, and part of me is afraid that if I go into the intricacies of the Federal Reserve, snoring will begin. And I don't want to disturb those of you that are paying attention by having you cope with a person next to you who's drooling on your shirt, right? So I've been hesitant to do it, but I'm going to try a little bit, just because we don't have that much time, a little bit, in the hopes of clearing up at least some confusions about this. Money has always been a difficult topic. All of us grow up in this culture having very complicated feelings about money, consciously complicated, and even much more unconsciously really complicated. We love it too much, we hate it too much, we do both at the same time. It's a mess, as it must be in our society. So money is a complicated matter. But it is, of course, what makes the world go round. Try to imagine your economic life without money. You go to work to get it, and then you spend it in order to acquire all the goods and services you want. Money is everywhere, an integral part of your life, and most of your basic decisions are shaped, at least in part, by your attitude towards your relationship to the money you either have or don't have or don't want, etc. So first of all, what is it? And how does it come to be? Here's a lot of confusion. The bulk of the money in our society, and by money I simply mean a piece of paper which has a magical quality. You take this piece of paper and you give it to another person, and they give you something you want. You want a haircut. You want an egg. You want a software program. You want a massage. And this is marvelous. A human being creates this thing for you, this good or this service, and you just give them a piece of paper. What is this about? And you really have to kind of be a child to understand this. If you try to be very sophisticated, you get all confused here because it isn't complicated. All right, what is the kind of paper that does most business in this country? It's nowadays either a check that you write. So you go into a store, you write a check, boom. It's a piece of paper, you give it to someone, they give you a shirt. Or you give them, because it's a little bit modern now, you give them a piece of plastic, which when they run it through a machine, moves a lot of pieces of paper around, but the end result is the same. You get the massage. You give the plastic, they run it through the machine, papers start moving, you don't see them, but at the end of the month you get a piece of paper, it reminds you of what all happened here. It's paper. So the bulk of the money is created by banks. It's the bank that lets you write a check, and it's the bank that lets you use that piece of plastic. It's the bank that sends you that bill at the end of the month. So money is created by banks. Now, why do they do that, the banks? Well, most of the money that they create is in the form of a loan. Here things get really excited. The bank gives you a loan. It creates money and gives you a loan. And the beauty of that for the bank is it doesn't do that because it likes you. It does it because it's going to get back more from you than it gives you. It's going to give you $100. You got to give it $105 by the end of the year. $100 back plus the interest. So the banks make their money by creating the money, lending it to you, and getting back more than they gave it to you. This is very exciting. If you're a banker, you can get carried away with this. We know that because in the history of banking, bankers always do get carried away with it. They never have otherwise. They get so excited. Wait a minute, when they figure out what it is they got here, well, we'll be richer the more loans we give. So let's go get everybody who isn't certifiably dead and get a loan going with them. Because we're going to get back more. And we can even afford to throw it at some people who won't pay us back. Because there'll be enough who do that it kind of works out. And so banks have always lent, you can see the logic here, to people who couldn't pay it back. There's no limit on where the banks will go to lend, because that's where their income comes from. So they lend, and they push. They push loans. You kind of notice that? The 800 little invitations to have a credit card that come to your mailbox? You notice that? They're pushing money on you. They're always doing that. And here comes then the second little dilemma. Banks are also a place where you keep your money. That is, if you have some money, you take it to the bank and you deposit it. You ask them to hold it for you until you need it, which they're happy to do, because while they're holding it for you, they lend it to somebody else and make money lending your money to somebody else. You can see how exciting this is. So they can either print it themselves, create it out of nothing. This is, I know, hard for you. Banks create it out of nothing. You go to a bank and you say, I'd like a loan. Here's what they do. They set up an account for you. You're John. They set up an account and they say, okay, as of tomorrow, you have $50,000 in the account. You go, really? Yes. How did you do that? I hit the 50,000 button on my machine. You got 50,000. And now you have to pay me interest for the period of time that you have. Go ahead, write checks, do whatever the hell you want. Use your credit card. That's it? That's how it works? Uh-huh. That's it. Now you can see there's a potential for abuse here. You can lend it, getting really excited, and you kind of have to lend it, because if you don't lend it, another bank will. And then they'll get the interest, and they'll become rich, and they'll be successful, and they'll have the new technology, and they'll have the new building on the corner, you know, the one right next to the 400 other buildings on that corner, all of which are banks, and you'll be the one left out. Nobody will go to you. You'll lose. So you have to give loans. You have to. Otherwise you die. In fact, you're always competing to look for somebody to give a loan to. So you give loans, and then they can't pay it back, and then you got a really scary problem. Because if they can't get the money paid back, then how are they going to give you the money you deposited? Because they lent that money to somebody, your money, and it isn't coming back. And then they call you up. This is the old days. They call you up and they say to you, John, we got some really bad news for you. You know that money you thought you had, that you gave us? We're really grateful, but we can't give it back to you. Maybe in a few weeks or months or years we'll get it back, and then we'll call you. Don't call us. We'll call you. When that happened, when people got the idea, oh my God, my deposits, if you're a company or an individual, they may not have the money to give me back what I gave them, then people would, I mean this literally, run to the bank. It's called a run on the banks. That's what it's called, and it comes from the spectacle which we used to see. Do you remember your American history? Some of you had a course. The bank panic of 1837. That's panic. That's the key word here. Run and panic. You understand banking. Periodically, people panic and run. Why do they run? Because they want to be the ones that get the money out before there isn't any anymore. The one who gets to the bank first might slither through the door, maybe hitting it with a hammer first, get through there, get their money out, so that their neighbor is told, sorry, you lose. This happens so often, so regularly, wiping out large numbers of people, that, this is going to come as a shock, people got angry at the banks and demanded that there be some kind of control, some kind of, don't let them just do this to us every few years. Everywhere in capitalism this happened. And so a government entity was set up called the central bank. So France has the Bank of France, or England has the Bank of England. We actually had a Bank of the United States back in the beginning of the 19th century, but then with Andrew Jackson, things got messy and they got very corrupted, so we got rid of it. So we don't have a Bank of the United States, But in 1913, when another bunch of panics drove everybody crazy, we created our own central bank. But because of the bad history of the Bank of America, or the Bank of the United States, we didn't call it that. We called it this funny thing, the Federal Reserve System. Funny name. Other countries don't do it. But, names are important in the United States. Remember? We don't have bus drivers. We have transportation engineers, all of that. So we have the Federal Reserve System. What is that? It divides the United States into 12 regions. New England is one region. They have a bank, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. The Middle States here has the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And the country is divided into 12 regions, and in each place there's a Federal Reserve Bank, which is a government entity partly, and it is controlled by private bankers. They work together. It's a kind of a compromise, part public, part private, that is designed to limit the amount of shenanigans, fakery, dishonesty, excess that the banking system is so prone to. And clearly, it's been a resounding success. That's a joke. I just did a joke. It's not successful because we just came out of 2008 when the whole thing blew apart. So its ability to prevent is not very good, but it intervenes. So, for example, after the excess, which it couldn't prevent, that led to the so-called subprime mortgage. What's a subprime mortgage problem? It's when the banks found people, certifiably not yet dead, and gave them a mortgage loan. They had no job. They had no conceivable way of paying any of this back, but they were given a loan because that's what banks do. They give loans. In the period from 2000 to 2008, a whole new profession grew in America called mortgage broker. What's that? That's a person who brings somebody who isn't dead yet to a bank and says, I got one. And the way the banks work, they gave you $1,000, a nice fee for bringing someone who would sign. Then there would be a very strange, very quick conversation in the bank office. The broker, it's your cousin Harry, brings in somebody he was drinking with all last week and says, see, he's got a pulse. He can sign his name. The banker then said, let me explain to you, and while Harry is nodding and weaving, the banker mumbles, at the end of which Harry signs. Great, says the bank. I just lent you $312,000. What does the bank do? Immediately, the bank takes that mortgage and sells it to somebody else. Because the bank, knowing exactly what your cousin Harry just did, knows that that will never be paid back because that guy drinks everything he earns and has no money. So you don't want to be stuck with a mortgage from someone like that because you know where that goes. No. But you sell it to somebody and the other person is an investor. Gee, how do you manage this? Because if the investor isn't a moron, he's not going to invest in, he's going to ask a question. What did they do? The banks entered into a cozy relationship with something called rating agencies. Moody's, Standard & Poor, and I forget Fitch. Those are the three big rating companies in the world. What they do is they look at a security and they tell you how safe it is. They rate them. If it's very safe, it's called a AAA. You've heard about these things? AA, and it goes on down. So the banks went to these, they said, I got the mortgages here. Don't you think they're wonderful? The agency said, are you kidding? I know that these people can't pay back. Well, you got a choice, the bank said. You either give me a AAA rating or I go to your competitor who will. Oh, I see. And they all got AAA ratings. Now you could go to a speculator and you could say, hey, this is a great investment. Whoa, AAA. The investors were still skeptical. So they demanded, I told you this would take a little longer. They demanded, that's not enough, a AAA. We want an insurance policy. We want the policy attached to that mortgage. Actually, they bundle them into groups of mortgages. We want an insurance policy, so if the deadbeats that you've lent money to can't pay the mortgage, they can't come up with the monthly, this insurance company will make the payment for them. It's insured. No problem, said the banks. And they invented something, you may have heard of it, called a credit default swap, CDS. This is basically a promise to cover if there's a default, if the mortgagee can't pay. If you can't pay your mortgage, then the insurance company will come in. These were written by, for example, the biggest insurance company in the world, AIG. It's an American International Group, biggest insurance company in the world, located up here in Manhattan on 3rd Avenue. And they wrote them because they sold them. The bank now had a mortgage. Stamped on it was AAA from the rating agency. The bank paid them a little something for that. And was an insurance company, which the bank bought. Stapled it to the mortgage. So you would invest. You'd say, well, I can't lose from this. I'm going to get 7% for 30 years. It's very safe, AAA. And even if it isn't, I got an insurance policy. In 2008, predictably, millions of Americans couldn't pay their mortgages because the economy collapsed. They lost their jobs. How are they going to pay their mortgage? So all the investors ran to the insurance company and said, pay. And the insurance company says, sorry, we don't have the money. No one made sure that the insurance companies had enough money to pay off on the policies they had sold. Nobody made sure. I'm going to say that again. And so everything collapsed. I'm describing the capitalism in which you live. So that the next time you hear or you say to somebody, well, we don't have to worry about that, that's clearly under control, you don't understand. Nothing is under control. It's the job of the people who run this economy to escape each of the controls. In fact, they take their hat off as a corporate leader, become a government official, to develop the controls which, when they go back into private industry, they know how to evade. That's what they've been doing for 250 years. But if you'd like to believe that it's now going to change, I have a bridge I can sell you also. The Federal Reserve failed to prevent the crisis. Then, reeling from the failure it had, it then bailed them out. Here's how they did that. They went to the bank who had no money, and they said, you do have money. How, said the bank. I just created it, said the Federal Reserve. Here's $1 trillion. That should help you. That's what they did. Trillions, quite a few trillions, were shoveled out to Citibank. All the private big banks were defunct. They were bankrupt. In the autumn of 2008, they were not functioning enterprises. They had panicky meetings in Lower Manhattan, a few blocks from here, trying to figure out what to do, and the answer was, the government has got to bail us out. They became overnight socialists. The government was to come in and take over and give them trillions of dollars, which the government did since they are the government. This was easy. I'll return to the Federal Reserve in future meetings. Yes, sir.
A question about the Fed. The Fed, unlike the Treasury, is not part of the U.S. government. The Treasury is, the Fed is not. So the Fed prints money, but the Treasury is not allowed to print money.
That's right.
The Fed lends this money to the Treasury, which then the Treasury owes, has a debt to the Fed to pay them back at a certain rate of interest. So isn't this a super scandal? If anyone should be printing money, shouldn't it be the Treasury?
Sure.
This is like the smoking on capitalism.
Well, careful. It used to be that governments printed money. It's famous all through history. People would get a gold coin that was printed by an emperor or a king, and then they ever see that little, where the person puts the coin in their mouth and bites into it? You know why that is? Because it had this much gold on it, and underneath it was a piece of wood. And the government made a lot of money out of very little gold so you had to bite it to see whether it was real gold or a piece of wood with it. It's the kind of thing you should be doing with your jewelry, in case you're not aware of it. So governments used to print money. And that became a scandal, too, because every time a government got into trouble, It just printed its way out of it, and so you didn't know whether the money you were holding would become worthless because suddenly there'd be so much of it around that nobody would touch it. So to prevent that, you didn't let the government, the treasury of the president or the power, make the money. You made an independent part of the government that wouldn't be quite so pliable for what the leaders wanted. That's why we have a Federal Reserve that's a little bit independent. The president of the country names the head of the Federal Reserve, so it's kind of in the government, sort of, but it's also out because it has private bankers in it and it has an independence. That's supposed to make it less likely to abuse its situation. And it is. It's less likely. Not unlikely, just less likely. It is.
Private bankers get a profit?
Sure. Private bankers work very hard to make the Federal Reserve give them a profit. They now, for example, right now banks have a ton of money that they're not lending to any businesses or people. They got burnt in 2008, and they don't trust you and me. For good reason. They don't pay us enough to live, so they don't trust to loan us. There's a logic to it. So they don't, what do they do with that money? They leave it in the Federal Reserve, which pays them an interest on it. But as I say, these are complicated issues. But the basic thing is the money supply is internal to our system. There's no gold standard. There's nobody standing outside the economy who makes sure it's all working. If you believe that, then we're in the realm of faith. There is nothing that controls this economy. There's nothing that makes sure it's all going to work out. I wish there were, but there isn't. And there never has been. This is a question of how the different parts interact, and it either works well or it doesn't. And believe me, the long history of capitalism gives us endless examples of when it works out badly.